right now. There is a narrative being broadcast across every major network, framing the current North American trade crisis as a catastrophic vulnerability for our country. You have probably seen the headline. You have seen the countdown clocks. You have heard the pundits warning that our economy is standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed. But what if I told you that the entire premise of this panic is a manufactured illusion? What is actually happening behind closed doors? Away from the theatrical press conferences and the thundering threats out of Washington is something the political class does not want to admit, because doing so would reveal a massive miscalculation. The truth is, the most aggressive economic weapon ever pointed at our border has just quietly backfired. And the architects of this pressure campaign are scrambling to hide the fallout. You need to understand the true physics of what is unfolding. Because this is no longer just about trade agreements. This is about the fundamental restructuring of our economic survival. So, Donald Trump did exactly what Donald Trump always does. He weaponized the most consequential trade agreement in North American history, taking CUSMA, a deal his own administration signed and paraded as a historic victory, and turning a scheduled legal review into a live, televised hostage situation. He slapped a 25% tariff wall across $155 billion worth of Canadian goods. He threatened to tear up the entire continental architecture of trade, and then stood in front of the cameras outside the White House to declare that Canada might simply not be worth negotiating with at all. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a backroom pressure tactic. It was a calculated, thundering act of structural economic coercion broadcast to every boardroom, every central bank, and every manufacturing floor on the planet. By the spring of 2026, with the July 1st CUSMA review deadline bearing down like a freight train on a locked track, the United States Trade Representative had already completed 2 full bilateral rounds of negotiations with Mexico. They had 2 more rounds explicitly scheduled, and made it unambiguously clear that Canada was, in their own words, behind on discussions. Think about what this means for the integrated architecture of our daily lives. We are talking about $700 billion in annual cross-border commerce. We are talking about the integrated supply chains of the automotive corridor, where Canadian auto parts are embedded inside vehicles assembled in Michigan and Ohio, securing thousands of jobs from Windsor to Oshawa. We are talking about the steel infrastructure of Ontario and Quebec, and the energy pipelines feeding American refineries with 64% of their crude oil supply. Every single load-bearing pillar of that system was being held at the edge of a cliff. And the man holding it there was grinning, because every historical precedent suggested we would eventually cave. The American political class, operating on the assumption that asymmetry of scale equals asymmetry of power, had spent 18 months pretending the dependency only ran one way. But that is not the most surprising part. What the White House had been deliberately and strategically obscuring from the public narrative is what that July 1st deadline actually means. If you look at the precise legal text of CUSMA itself, July 1st, L'Enseigning Archelot, is not a termination date. It is not an expiration. It is not a detonator. It is simply a decision point, a legal junction at which the 3 signatory parties must signal one of 3 outcomes. They can renew the deal for 16 years. They can withdraw entirely, which still requires 6 months of formal advance notice and keeps the deal in force during that period. Or they can signal both non-renewal and non-withdrawal, which triggers an annual review mechanism keeping the entire agreement in force. Legally binding, fully enforceable, and protecting all existing trade exemptions continuously all the way to 2036. The Eurasia Group had already identified this dynamic, describing CUSMA as a zombie agreement that would stagger on, neither fully dead nor alive, Trump's team built a countdown clock to a deadline that structurally and legally does not end the way they were advertising it. The coercion was a performance. The leverage was manufactured. And Canada's negotiators understood the contract far better than the people threatening to tear it up. Make no mistake, the initial tariff campaign was designed to be decisive and brutal. When it began on February 1st, levying taxes on most Canadian imports and hitting our energy products with a 10% rate. The stated rationale was border security, but the actual mechanics were pure economic compression. The expectation in Washington was that Canada would break within weeks, and the damage at home was undeniably real, documented, and measurable. The Bank of Canada moved into a defensive posture as our gross domestic product contracted under the weight of the levies. Economists estimated the tariff cycle had carved up to 2% out of our national economy. You felt this directly. Canadian households were absorbing between $1,700 and $2,000 in additional annual costs. That is grocery money, mortgage payments, and heating bills vanishing into thin air. Ontario and Quebec, the industrial core of our economy, were taking the hardest hits with effective tariff rates on American-bound exports exceeding 6%. By every conventional metric of a geopolitical coercion campaign, the pressure was working. What happened next was even more revealing, because while the headlines were diligently tracking the damage to Canada, a quiet and irreversible reorientation was accelerating beneath the surface of every trade data report and corporate filing. In the 12 months ending January 2026, Canadian merchandise exports to non-American economies surged by an astonishing 17%. Simultaneously, our exports to the United States fell by 10%. Canadian firms operating across 27 separate trading partners at once had already recovered nearly $11 billion of the $18.5 billion in annual export revenue lost to the American trade war. Our businesses were rotating their export markets faster than most analysts had believed structurally possible. The federal government stepped in, announcing a budget with the explicit objective of doubling non-American exports by 2035, backed by massive new infrastructure investments. Mark Carney flew to Beijing and secured a preliminary bilateral agreement with China, reducing our tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for Beijing dropping tariffs on Canadian canola oil entirely and suspending levies on other critical agricultural exports. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Canadian supply chain was not simply absorbing pain, it was deliberately and permanently rerouting. Every new long-term contract signed with a European buyer was a ratchet-clicking. Every grain deal with an Asian importer was a ratchet-clicking. Every energy agreement with a non-American refinery was a ratchet-clicking. And the ratchet does not click back. When the Trump administration sent signals in the spring of 2026 that it expected Canada to pay an entry fee, a package of preemptive concessions just to be granted the privilege of sitting down at the negotiating table, Mark Carney did something that violated every assumption the White House pressure model relied upon. He refused. It was not a counter-proposal. It was not a softened alternative to preserve the appearance of engagement. It was a direct, publicly stated refusal. When asked whether Canada should make concessions to access trade talks, Carney's answer landed in a single syllable: no. He told reporters with precise language that the United States alone would not dictate the terms. Canada had not stormed out in a rage. We had simply declined, without drama and without apology, to enter a room architecturally designed for our subordination. The counterstrike was already deployed before the press conference even ended. While the United States and Mexico were running bilateral rounds to isolate us, Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc sent a formal written letter to the United States Trade Representative and Mexico's Economy Secretary. The letter recommended simply renewing CUSMA for the full 16-year period. No annual review mechanism triggered. No renegotiation framework opened. No entry fee tendered. The letter was precise and absolutely devastating in what it implied. Canada was not refusing to negotiate. Canada was communicating that we are perfectly comfortable living under the deal that already exists. A deal that already governs our trade and remains in legal force until 2036. Now we need to talk about Warren Buffett. Because what just happened maps onto his economic frameworks with uncomfortable precision. Buffett talks about the hostage paradox. This paradox states that the moment the party wielding coercive leverage makes the consequences of refusal explicit and public, they have disclosed the absolute ceiling of their power. They hand their counterpart a map. When Trump announced that Canada could face permanent tariffs instead of a negotiation, he did not project strength. He announced a maximum outcome. He showed us that the worst thing that could happen was a permanent tariff, something Canada had already spent 14 months adapting to, partially offsetting through global trade diversion, and legally challenging. The threat became a ceiling rather than an escalating weapon. As Buffett would say, the most dangerous thing you can do in a negotiation is tell the other party what your best move looks like, because now they only have to survive that one thing. Buffett also talks about the structural void principle. When a dominant market actor weaponizes its position as a buyer, it engineers a reliable absence of stable commerce that alternative trading architectures rush to fill. That 17% surge in Canadian exports to non-American markets was not a temporary workaround. It was a structural void filling in real time, and it fills permanently. Every new relationship Canada built requires no American permission to maintain. It generates revenue independent of their chaotic election cycles. The numbers become even more concerning when you look closer at the American side of this ledger, because the fallout was landing aggressively on the exact constituencies the White House promised to protect. American farmers across the Midwest, who had exported commodities into Canada under zero tariff conditions for 30 years, were suddenly absorbing retaliatory levies that crushed their margins during a period of already strained agricultural profitability. The American automotive industry absorbed tariff exposure that General Motors cited as a massive risk variable, leading directly to delayed hiring and suppressed capital expenditure. American construction companies faced sustained cost inflation as Canadian lumber tariffs pushed input prices into ranges that actively delayed residential development across a dozen states, heavily worsening their own housing supply crisis. American energy refineries, dependent on us for 64% of their crude oil, were pricing in supply uncertainty that flowed directly into consumer fuel costs at every single pump. Then, the American legal system itself completely dismantled their own scaffolding. In early 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down several of Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs, ruling that the executive branch had vastly exceeded its statutory authority. The legal architecture of coercion was found unconstitutional from within their own judicial framework. The framework detonated structurally from the inside. What happened in the North American Trade Corridor is a precise demonstration of what structural power actually looks like when it refuses to be baited into performing weakness. Trump arrived loud. He arrived with countdown clocks and public ultimatums. He detonated the established framework with a confidence built entirely on the assumption that we would eventually capitulate. He was catastrophically wrong about what Canada had been quietly engineering with the time that asymmetry created. While Trump was holding press conferences about leverage, we were restructuring our export architecture across 27 markets. The Canadian dollar priced in the uncertainty and held its ground. The $11 billion in recovered export revenue is permanent market penetration that no subsequent American administration can reverse with a single tweet. The supply chains that rerouted are not returning. There is a profound lesson here for every ordinary citizen worrying about the future of their livelihood, their wages, and their country. It is the lesson that surfaces in every confrontation between a party that performs power and a party that engineers it. The party that performs power builds spectacle. It creates countdowns. It relies on noise. The party that engineers power works quietly. It methodically reduces the cost of refusal until the aggressor's threat is no longer a weapon that can determine outcomes, but merely a weather condition. Something to be modeled, adapted to, absorbed, and ultimately outlasted. Trump came for a trade war. We came with a structural reorientation of the Canadian export economy, a 17% surge in new global revenues, a Supreme Court ruling dismantling their tariff regime, and 7 words delivered without a single raised voice. The Americans alone will not dictate the terms. Power is not maintained by volume. It is maintained by architecture. And Canada just showed the world exactly how strong our architecture really is.